Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, Cash, long time, man.
Yeah, man. How you doing? You all right?
Very well, very well. So right now we have Dr. Booker on the call, So Dr. Booker is probably somebody you may want to talk to, Cashew, about. She has teaching opportunities in the United States. I know you want to come to Saudi, but she has opportunities in the United States. Just might want to just explore your options, because you're highly qualified.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. We have how are you, Dr. Davis? How are you?
Great. Good to see you. I'm excited. Thanks for inviting me.
Yep. Thank you. And we have Naima. How are you? Haven't spoken to you in a while. How's everything? Everything well for you?
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Yes, I'm doing very well. How are you?
Very well. Alhamdulillah. All right, so we have folks coming in. I guess some of my students should be coming in shortly. But let's go ahead and get started. This is really, right now we have a lot of very intelligent people in the room. So I really want this to be a conversation because everyone in the room right now is an educator. So hopefully as people trickle in, they could benefit from this discussion. I really wanted to be a discussion because differentiation does mean so much, a lot to many different people. It looks differently. And we're going to talk about that a lot. So I want you guys to feel free to chime in. I'm going to ask some questions just to build dialogue. And again, we already have some very intelligent people in the room. So this should be a very interesting conversation. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm not going to, I try not to PowerPoint you to death, but I just wanted to kind of keep my focus. So we're going to do a PowerPoint presentation, but I promise it should not be death by PowerPoint. It should not be. All right, let's get this party started. Do this first. All right. So basically, what I want to talk about and mainly have the focus be is the affordances of differentiation in a classroom. And I want to start off talking about some background information. And again, because we have a lot of smart people in the room, this should be an interesting conversation. So as a dialogue, feel free to chime in if you want to add, amend, or if I say something that's totally off the scales, please jump in and call me an idiot. We're going to talk about what differentiation is and is not, the rationale for differentiation, the learner profile, which is the focus of my my research. We're going to talk about types of learners, the role of the differentiated teacher, and we're going to end the conversation talking about how a differentiated environment looks like. So let's talk about a little background information. Again, you guys are smart. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over these points, but I want to talk about this. Now, Dr. Booker knows where I got this from. Hopefully. Do you know where I got this from? You know where I stole this from, Dr. Booker?
Actually, I don't, but I'm curious for you to re-jog my memory.
You don't know where I stole this from? I'm plagiarizing like a champion right here. That's why I have to say I'm plagiarizing. So I got to give credit where credit due. This is from Dr. Thomas, Bishop Thomas.
Oh, okay, I know it was familiar to me. Yes, sir.
You remember now? And this is always stuck with me, that good meat makes its own gravy. And ultimately, isn't that what professional teaching is about? It's about making ourselves, improving ourselves, continuously improving ourselves. And as a result of that commitment to teachers and learners, we get good. So things just start happening. So if I go back for a second, notice what I entitled this talk, the affordances of differentiated. And I think the key word is affordances, because when we improve our craft, our skill, when we really dive into teaching and learning and we do it compassionately, the gravy comes out. That unexpected benefit, it emits from us, and we become the role model, that student teacher, the teacher leader, and we don't even know it. It's an affordance. And this is why I'm so happy that you guys came on the call tonight. And the reason why I did the call is because, as educators, we always need to continuously improve, and remind ourselves of what best practices look like. And in my opinion, differentiation is a best practice. And it's something that we all should be doing all the time. And again, it looks different where you are, the students you have. That's why I love differentiation, because there's no right or, well, it's probably some wrong answers, but there's a lot of rights, right? You can do a lot of things right here. So I wanted to start off with a quote by Dr. Walter Scott Thomas from New Psalmist Baptist Church. And he has a book called Good Meat Makes Its Own Gravy. But that, again, as a teacher, that always stuck with me, and it motivated me to want to really dive into the art of teaching. So when we talk about good meat makes its own gravy, I think about three things. I think about content, process, and product. Content, process, and product. Content, what we teach. Process, how we teach it. And product, which I think many good teachers get the content and the process down pat for the most part. Good teachers do, but it seems like we always fall short on the product. How do we measure what success looks like? And did we really think about what success looks like? And is success, are we looking at success from a homogeneous perspective? Are there many versions of success? And I think that's often where we fall short when we talk about differentiation and when we talk about student outcomes. So this is going to be a theme throughout this talk, is this idea of content, process, and product. What we teach, how we teach it, and in my opinion, most importantly, or equally as important, is the product. What does success look like? How does a student demonstrate success? So I just want to, Dr. Davis, you can jump in on this because you're probably the expert here. Learning starts when students feel safe. So I just wanted to this is kind of my prerequisite talk before we dive into differentiation specifically. Nothing happens. You can have differentiation, problem-based learning, project-based learning, student-centered learning. You could be a fan of all these things. But unless the teaching environment is safe and you are safe, there's no learning that's going to take place. Absolutely zero, zilch, zero. There's research. I can give you research among research around research that shows you if students don't feel safe, then learning will not take place. I don't care how great your lesson plan is, how many degrees you have. And what does safe look like? Safe looks like dealing with students' wants, needs, and expectations. Okay. By the way, this has nothing to do with content, process, and product. Okay, you can have that down pat, but if you don't deal with the safety aspect of it, then nothing else matters. I thought making it more relative to what's going on in 2022. We know that Chicago Public Schools, the teachers union, and the mayor's office, the city of Chicago, they came up with an agreement that teachers are going to go back to school, students are going to go back to school live. And I found that very interesting, given all the issues with safety in Chicago. So the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Lightfoot, was demanding that students go back to school. And I was always thinking, they go back to school, and I know all of Chicago is not dangerous, but there are parts of Chicago that is very dangerous. So what about that safety aspect? And so no one mentioned that. Okay, get the students back in school for what reason? Because in certain schools in Chicago, I'm pretty sure safety is a concern given their homicide rate. So until we have to understand that we have to, when we talk about teaching and learning, we have to keep everyone in the mix. We have to keep not only students and teachers and administrators, but also parents and elected officials and police departments. All of this really supports when we want to dive into best practices like differentiation. I want to stop there for a second. Am I off track here? Does anyone have any comments about that? Does anyone disagree with that? Can you teach in an environment?
I just wanted to say that I really appreciate that this is where the conversation is starting, because I think as educators, there can be so much, and there's a lot of processes here. Like as a teacher, you can have this excitement of getting your content out, like you said, and then there can be the expectation from department chairs and accreditation saying you have to get this content out within these certain amount of weeks. But I found, like you had said, that there has to be, and I found that it has to be continuous for me throughout the semester. It can't just be, the first day of class, we're going to go over the syllabus and we're just going to cover class rules and expectations, but it has to be throughout the curriculum and throughout the year of trying to create that space of, one of the things that I like to do is, I forget what I call it, but I like to have ask them at the beginning of class to just unanimously, to not even put their name on a piece of paper, but to tell me some of the things that their expectations for the course, some of their fears, some of the things that make them excited, and then I'll collect them. And this idea of safety often comes up as it relates to, I just want to feel like I'm safe to explore different thought processes, to not necessarily be judged, really wanting, and I think a lot of this hasn't been written down before, but I can feel it through students, is wanting me as an instructor to create that foundation. And a lot of that takes a lot of work, whether it's creating a lot of, again, time before I even go into curriculum, and even knowing when to pause throughout when I know, okay, safety seems like it's fragile right here. Let's take a pause. But I love that we're having this conversation starting out, because it's so easy. And I found that honestly for myself to be like, I want to cover all this content. Man, this is so exciting. And I'll go in, and then when and this is kind of like even throughout, I can feel like we need to pause and make sure that we kind of set the groundwork. And I think that for me as a counselor educator, I teach, my background is teaching master's level counseling students who are going to be therapists and things like that. It's a great way to also talk about how to work with clients. So if I don't, as a educator, set the standard in terms of creating safety for them, then how do they create that in that space with clients? So I think there's so many dynamics here. And I just, I'm appreciative that we're starting here, because there's so much, I feel, pressure sometimes to just get in there and cover stuff. And I can tell sometimes students are like, you know, it's hard to embrace that when that foundation. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you hit it. I mean,
Ray, I would like to jump in and also respond.
Yes, Dr. Brooke.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, where you are, or afternoon, depending on where you are. One of the big things that we are talking about and what we're seeing, in kind of response to your question, you know, why would we be sending kids back knowing the temperature and what does the safety look like? You'll hear a big buzzword that we're talking about lately in the last couple of years around this social emotional learning, and really embedding social emotional learning into our differentiated practices. And when we talk about that, very similar to the young lady who just spoke, we do this kind of temperature check where when we start the lesson off, before we jump into the content, we really kind of gauge where our kids are. We have some kind of question. We have some kind of speaking point that just kind of, sometimes it might even be emojis, or it might be a fist of five. How are we feeling today? To just kind of gauge where our students are before we jump into the content. That allows a teacher to know, okay, everybody's feeling pretty good. Let's go ahead. We're ready to go in for instruction. Something's kind of going on, and so forth. So you'll hear a lot of talk about this as social emotional learning. We can all have our own personal feelings. You know, me personally, I'm wondering as well why we're bringing kids back to school. But I hear the comments from a lot of superintendents and a lot of politicians around the country. And in some cases, particularly like in Chicago, like you're speaking of, or Baltimore, where I'm at, even though our cities and areas may be full of crime and issues, often the schoolhouse is still the safest place for a student during the day. And so it's a risk. However, it's the safest place for a student to go, where that teacher is going to show some love, some attention. They're going to get that meal for the day. Those basic set of needs are going to be met. And the other thing, you know, having been a principal for a while, one of the things that I heard the superintendent say was that if we don't bring these kids back, there are some kids we're never going to see again. And that's the reality. Once they get disconnected and we lose a pulse on them, we are still trying to recover kids from a year ago and 2 years ago that even at the elementary, middle school level have never returned to school. We don't know where they are. They relocated, they moved, and just trying to put a pulse on. So that's why you'll see in some aspects political, as well as a lot of undercurrent political issues. Money is involved in government policies, but many do believe that the schoolhouse is the safest place for students. And when we engage at social emotional learning, it's beneficial for our students just to kind of, when teachers and practitioners have been taught how to engage it, you know, around trauma-informed care and just restorative practice and different types of social emotional learning, it does make being able to teach and get into this content and product and things a lot easier. So thank you for letting me share that.
Awesome.
Ray, I'd like
Awesome.
to.
I was going to ask you from a British perspective, as a British administrator, I was going to ask you, so I'm glad you jumped in.
It's quite actually interesting to hear the different perspectives coming from the North American teachers. I'm guessing you guys are all from the States, even though your accents do sound a little bit similar. But on the other side of the pond, context is quite important. And just to give you an overview, when a teacher is looking towards getting the qualified teacher status in England, they have to tick off a certain standards of teacher standards, 8 altogether. And often in those teacher standards, before they get qualified, you hear often phrases such as establish a safe and stimulating environment for pupils rooted in mutual respect, set goals, know and understand how to assess relevant subjects, make use of formative assessments. And there's a big dilemma currently in England that is surrounding more on the actual curriculum rather than the actual context of background issues. One of the biggest issues that we're facing here personally from my perspective is the issue with the actual curriculum itself. We have a national curriculum which is across the board, whether you're a privately educated child or whether you go to a public school. The government is actually the system that sets up the actual curriculum. And it's quite hypocritical because what you'll find is you have an entire curriculum that is created for middle class students that are essentially being focused and challenged specifically for children from socially, culturally, and economically deprived background. So you'll have children who are at private schools paying 30,000, 40,000 pounds a year that are going to be sitting the exact exam as children who come from broken homes. So when you look at the entire system within itself, before you even begin, the children are almost set up to fail from the beginning. Fortunately for me, I'm currently working at a school where the majority of the children come from ethnically diverse backgrounds, so children mostly with parents from Africa or Southeast Asia. So I've been fortunate enough to directly engage parental involvement. That's another massive issue that we're having here in England. Children, particularly from ethnic minority backgrounds, their parents are rarely involved in the education of their children. So we're often left to do not only the educational aspect of things, but the parenting. So from the very onset of the beginning, I think we face challenges that sometimes is extremely almost impossible to overcome because on one hand, we're expected to be accountable for people's attainment, progress, outcomes, to be aware of their capabilities, their prior knowledge. But between 7 and 3:30, I think it's extremely overwhelming to even engage some of the students when you know that the circumstances beyond the school gates is going to set them up automatically to fail in the beginning.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I don't even know where to go with that because, the differentiated classroom takes in mind all learners. So when we have this big national curriculum, that could jeopardize our efforts as teachers, especially when you're talking about high stakes testing. And then, that's another aspect of safety. And my apologies for just talking about safety from a violence standpoint. Safety, I think Dr. Davis hit on this. It goes more than just violence. It's just what students feel, and I think Kashi, you hit on this perfectly. What do you feel like if you are in London, but you're from Pakistan? And you're migrated from Pakistan, or you're migrated from Sudan, or other places around the world, and you might not be affluent. How does it feel to be an ELL learner in a native environment? So when we talk about safe, I don't mean to limit safety to just the issue of violence. Man, we probably can go on and on with that, but let me move on for the sake of time. So I just wanted to briefly talk about the brain science because we kind of talked what we feel and our experiences, but let's just talk about the brain really quickly for those people who are more quantitative, right? So first, when we talk about where information goes and where learning starts, learning really starts with the reticular activating system, right? So as educators, we need to know that every last one of us has this part of the brain called the reticular activating system. And its sole purpose is to keep you safe. So when we receive inputs, the inputs first go to the RES. And it wants to know, is this safe? And if the information is not safe, if the teacher is angry, if they experienced something in the hallways prior to coming into class, if the information, if the lessons are positioned in a different part of the classroom, different things can really aggravate the RES. So we, as teachers, we need to understand that it's a human reaction to send information to the non-thinking part of the brain if we feel like information is unsafe. And what happens in that non-thinking part of the brain? Well, We got the fight, flight, or freeze response. And we see that. And we all, as educators, we know what that looks like. So again, our job is to make sure that we satisfy the requirements of the RES, making sure information is safe and that the learning environment is safe. After the RES is satisfied, then it goes to the amygdala. And the amygdala is the conductor of the brain. And the amygdala is concerned with one primary issue. The RES is concerned with, is the information safe? The amygdala is concerned with, what's in it for me? What's in it for me? Why I need to learn this, right? So I think what you're going to find out is, as we start to talk about the differentiated learning, differentiated learning deals specifically with the amygdala. What's in it for me? So when you differentiate your instruction, you can keep students on task because you're dealing with their wants, needs, and expectations, which makes the amygdala happy. And if we can make the amygdala happy, the amygdala will have a conversation with the hippocampus and to send that information to the frontal lobe where all our long-term memories are stored. And when those long-term memories are stored, then students have a basis to receive future information. And that's how we learn. We learn from a starting point. Stephen Krashen, he had a formula and he called it I+1. I+1 equals growth, right? So you probably learned this, and if you're a linguistics major, I+1. So when you're learning a language, you start off with your prior knowledge and you add one bit of information to it, I+1. And that's how we learn. That's how we learn everything, is this idea of I+1. So again, when we talk about differentiation, we have to keep content, process, and product in mind. We have to keep a safe environment in mind. We have to keep what the brain expects in mind. And we have to keep this idea of I+1 in mind. Right? Just to dive, just as a reminder, again, we have a lot of smart people in the room, but just as a reminder, remember that we learn, there's two types of learning, explicit learning and implicit learning. And often in a regular classroom, a teacher-based instructor, that instructor is focusing mainly on explicit learning, right? Because it's very declarative, right? We can get students to verbalize the learning. So that learning can be semantic or episodic. But we often, as educators, even good educators, sometimes we forget about the implicit learning, the things that we're doing or not doing that students are still learning, right? So students learn both explicitly, meaning declarative, they can verbalize it, and they're learning implicitly, things that they cannot verbalize, but they're still learning, and it affects future learning. Remember, go back to the I+1. So we have to keep that in mind. And again, the beauty of differentiated instruction is the differentiated teacher is serving as a statue that students can gaze upon to learn both explicitly and implicitly. So we got to learn, when we do certain things as teachers, as parents, as uncles, aunts, neighbors, as people, that learners, children in particular, but even adults, are learning explicitly and implicitly. They're learning from the things they're learning things that we want them to learn, and also things that we may not even wanted them to learn. There's a Dr. Diane Lawson-Freeman. She has a quote: "Students do not learn because we teach." Right? And then there's another doctor, Dr. Judy Willis. And what they learn is not necessarily what was taught. Students do not learn because we teach. Dr. Diane Lawson Freeman, University of Michigan, and Dr. Judy Willis, famous neuroscientist. What was learned and what is learned is not necessarily what is taught. And I think both of them are hitting on this idea of implicit learning. As teachers, we have to remember and remind ourselves that students learn explicitly and implicitly. That means we have to really watch everything we do, and everything we do needs to be well thought out. And the ultimate goal is learning transfer, right? And I think sometimes we, in the hustle and bustle of teaching, we forget that's the goal, because everyone talks about lifelong learning, right? That's kind of the mantra: lifelong learning, lifelong learning, lifelong learning. You hear this over and over again. But you don't get lifelong learning until you get until students experience learning transfer. And again, in a differentiated classroom, the possibilities, and we can't predict when learning transfer takes place, but the possibilities for learning transfer are more likely to happen when we follow the best practices of differentiated instruction. All right, how am I doing so far? Any concerns, disagreements, comments? No?
I'm with you on that one, to be honest with you, completely. Not to disturb your flow, but there's a theory I read a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember the article, but it goes into the process that learning is a biological process, and to understand it from a pedagogy perspective is the biological process of learning that starts with the neurons, which are, I think he was explaining that, electrically activated brain cells, and that learning is achieved due to changing the strength and numbers of the neural pathways, which involves a process known as synaptic plasticity, is called, I think. But the point that the author was trying to make was that essentially, as educators, we don't actually make anybody learn anything. We just give them the tools to help them develop the neurons in order for them to actually process that in their minds. So it's quite fascinating, because when we look at it from just the teacher's perspective, our job is to execute the content of the materials. But on the other hand, we have a human being that's in front of us who has this completely individual neurons and biological process of the way they understand things. So it's quite fascinating how you put the two together, actually.
Absolutely. We got to remember that students are not computers. They're human beings. And we don't teach, as you just said, we don't teach them anything. All we can do is be role models, guiders, coaches, facilitators. This slide here, I put this one in specifically for Saudi and other places in the world, because this is not necessarily the case in the States. I don't know about the UK, but here in Saudi, there's a strong emphasis, a heavy emphasis on the textbook. So we have a lot of textbook teaching, and teaching that requires teachers to turn and review every page from the page 1 to page 25, until the end of the book, and as long as there's no Islamic objections to what is being taught. And in a differentiated classroom, the textbook is a resource, not the content or not the curriculum. It's only a resource helping students to understand and know, or know and understand rather. So I don't want to beat that, because I can get into my soapbox about that. And then I also want to talk about, from a teacher's perspective and student's perspective, that we got to keep in mind that as teachers, as educators, we need to be focused on a growth mindset instead of a fixed mindset. And fixed mindset is probably more teacher-based instruction, right? Whereas a growth mindset is student-centered learning, right? Again, it's a lot of smart people in this room. I'm not gonna talk a lot about that, because you guys know what a fixed mindset and a growth mindset is, or what they are. But just keep in mind that differentiated teacher has definitely a growth mindset, and she is trying to emit that growth mindset energy off to learners. All right. And I call it, and I covered this already, but implicit learning, explicit, implicit learning, it's the message stuff. Because students may be learning stuff, they may have learned stuff that you didn't want them to learn. And it can, when we talk about explicit learning, implicit learning, it can get messy. I kind of already beat that drum. Another thing that's messy is that parents and we have to remind ourselves that parents and guardians are instrumental in the teaching and learning process. And often we don't include parents and guardians enough in the teaching and learning process. We talk sometimes, often when we talk about collaboration and differentiation, we're talking about what we can't control. But I think what we can't control, or what we can control, which is the artificial learning in the classroom. But there's some real learning going on, right? Implicitly and explicitly outside the classroom. So we have to enlist and inform, and I invited parents to come on today. I don't know if we have any parents outside of teachers, educators who are already parents, but just parents who came on to listen as parents. If you are here today, I just wanted you to know that we appreciate you and that you are the primary teachers for your children. Not us teachers, not us, social scientists. So that ends my prerequisites to this talk, to this idea of differentiation. Are there any other prerequisites we should cover before we talk about what differentiation is not? No? All right, so let's dive into what differentiation is not. Differentiation is not individualized instruction. I think a lot of people think that differentiation is writing lesson plans for every student in the classroom. Mr. Ray, I don't have time to differentiate instruction. I hear that often. I don't have time to write, 25 different lesson plans for every student. And there's a lot of teachers who think differentiation is writing individual lesson plans for every student. That's not differentiation, that's personalization, two different things, right? And what we have learned is personalization is, number one, is not logistically plausible, right? In many cases, because you get teacher burnout. And it's really not effective when you use that as a main strategy, all right? If you agree, if you disagree with anything I'm saying out of my list here, just let me know, stop me and speak your piece. Differentiation is not chaotic. So a lot of teachers say, well, Mr. Ray, that means I have all these different things going on in the classroom. And I'm one teacher. How am I supposed to manage? These are fourth graders. They're already off the hook. I'm already having classroom management issues with them. You want me, it's better for me just to get all the students to do one thing and, and keep them busy. Because if I try to have students do different things have different things going on in the classroom, then, I'm just going to have chaos. And my retort to that is a differentiated class is not going to be chaotic. It's going to be very well structured because it's going to be well planned out, because it's going to deal with students' wants, needs, and expectations, right? And there are going to be procedures that students can follow when they are off task or they feel like they're struggling. Because the reality is, as we said earlier, students do not learn because we teach. In a differentiated classroom, we're giving them flexibility and we're giving choices for them. So if well planned out, we can end chaos. So it's not chaotic. Differentiation is not a way to provide homogeneous groupings. So differentiation is not putting all the the advanced students in one group, all the, the the average students in one group, all the all the struggling students in another group, students who are trailing behind in one group. That's not differentiation. And I've heard that, well, I can just I can ability group my students. Well, the research says on ability grouping that it's just not as effective as mixed ability groups. That's what the research says. So obviously we want to follow best practices. So we definitely, in a differentiated classroom, we don't want to have homogeneous groups. Now, there are times in a differentiated class that creating or setting up homogeneous groups works. There are times where it does work, but it's not strictly creating homogeneous grouping. Differentiation is not tailoring the same suit for all students. And what do I mean by that? Differentiation is about tailoring instruction, but tailoring instruction for individual students' want, needs, and expectations. It's not taking one lesson and then doing a series of micro differentiation, right? So we take one lesson and we tell the advanced student, here, you're going to do something more complex. And then we'll take the struggling students and we're going to say, well, you can skip this question, or you can read this text instead of reading the text everyone else is reading. That's not differentiation. All right. That is micro differentiation, which can work in some cases, but it's not differentiation as a best practice. Differentiation is teaching up, is giving all students a challenge and then helping students through scaffolding to get to that challenge, and creating a learning environment where all students are helping one another. Because again, going back to implicit learning, I think it's fair to say that learning is not just about the content. And you hit on this earlier, Kashi. It's not just about the content. There are other things that need to be learned. How to work with one another. Dr. Booker talked about emotional intelligence. All right, social learning. All right, these are just as important to student success as learning content. So the group dynamics and how students work one another and how they support one another and helping students manage that community that is supportive of one another, that's also learning that's taking place. Implicit, explicit, and they're all just as important because they develop they can develop and support learning transfer, and it can develop a lifelong learner. And differentiation is not just for the outliers. They're not just for students with special needs or gifted and talented for students. Differentiation is for all students in your classroom. All right, I want to stop there. Does anyone want to add anything about what differentiation is not? Come on, guys, don't let me talk the whole time now. Anything that I missed on what differentiation is not? No? I guess I'm doing good then. Or I'm doing very bad. All right, let's talk about what differentiation is. Differentiation is proactive, right? It deals with planning. Differentiation is more qualitative than quantitative. What do I mean by that? Differentiation is qualitative than it is quantitative. Anybody want to kind of explain that? Anybody want to jump in?
Would that be more on the focus on the, I think you were talking about earlier, the three process of content, process, and product. With the previous quote that you just mentioned, that'd be more focused on the actual content of the curriculum rather than focusing.
It's qualitative.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a part of it. It's about being flexible. It's about knowing what's going on at the moment with the students that you have in your classroom, right? So Dr. Kamara DeVelu, he had the post-method condition, and he had the 3 Ps. And I think this touches on the 3 Ps. 3 Ps is particularity, practicality, and possibility. Now, particularity, meaning that we have individual learners in our class. And although you'll never see a learner like that one learner that's in your class, you'll never see that learner again. You know, you see learners like that learner. So when we talk about differentiation as qualitative, we're talking about that we have to keep a mindset of who we have in the classroom right then and there, so we can provide the other P's, possibility, and that we can also possibilities for that student and those students, and practicality, provide instruction that's going to be practical for every student in the classroom. So that's what we mean by qualitative versus quantitative. A quantitative teacher is the teacher with the fixed mindset, right? The teacher-based instruction. All right, we're going to learn this, and and some of you are going to pass, and some of you are going to fail. That's the quantitative teacher. That's the fixed mindset. That's teacher-based instruction. Differentiation is routed in assessment. Okay, routed in assessment. And this goes back to the qualitative part. We're always observing. We're always concept checking. We're always making sure and learning about our students' wants, needs, and expectations. Right? That's what goes on in a student. We're always trying our best to make data-informed or data-driven decisions in a quantitative classroom. All right, that in a differentiated classroom, we're doing a lot of pre-testing. All right. We're doing a lot of diagnostics to figure out so we can properly plan on what students' want, needs, and expectations are. All right, so pre-assessments are very important in a differentiated classroom. If you're teaching World War II to a group of 10th grade students in your world history class, and you don't pre-test them or give them some type of pre-assessment on World War II, then where do you start in World War II? How do you satisfy that amygdala? Remember, they got this thing called the amygdala in their brain. What's in it for me? I don't need to learn about World War II. I don't care less about Hitler. Isn't he dead? Right? Why should I know this? So until we do some type of pre-assessments, diagnostic, probably well before that unit starts, so we could plan for the particularity, going back to Dr. Kamara DeVelu, for the particularity of those students in that class, so we can have meaningful instruction. So the differentiating classroom is rooted in assessments. Also, summative assessments are conducted in different modalities. You know, summative assessments don't necessarily always have to be pen and paper. All right? That we figure out other ways that students, the product, remember the CPP, the product, other ways students can demonstrate that they know. And that's what goes on in differentiated classroom. In the differentiated classroom, we're taking multiple approaches to content, process, and product. All right. And that these these approaches are grounded in context. All right. And what is context? And the context is extremely important in the differentiated classroom. So what is context? Anybody want to talk about what context is? Because I think it's very important. Anybody want to chime in about context? All right. Context is really prior knowledge. Absolutely. Prior knowledge, absolutely. Context is what the student understands. All right. Prior knowledge, context is what the student understands, not what you understand. It's what the student understands. Okay. What the students know to be true. And so we have to contextualize our teaching. So a differentiated instructor contextualizes their teachings. Context is what the students understand. It's very important. Sometimes when we think about context, we'll give students context, but then we don't give them context that they understand. We give them context that we understand. You know, when I was in school, well, you're 50 years old. They're 14. You can't give them that context of when you were in school. It has to be context that they understand. Krashen also talked about comprehensible inputs. You know, when we're teaching, comprehensible inputs must be what? They must be understandable.
1 plus.
Say that again?
I plus. So the input's going to be one level above the current context of the student, because that's where Krashen says that's where the the growth takes place. You know, when going back to the plasticity. So if the content is one level above the student's current situational learning, then they're able to hopefully stretch, and this is what causes growth.
Absolutely.
And transference.
Absolutely, Musa. And he also said that those inputs must be what? They must be understandable, and they must be what? Compelling.
Understandable.
And compelling.
Compelling. Yeah.
When we talk about comprehensible inputs, we get the understandable part. And this lies in the context. But it also must be compelling. And this is very important for the differentiated class. That instruction must be compelling. Remember, we're dealing with students' want, needs, and expectations. It must be compelling. If it's boring, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. The differentiated classroom is student-centered. It's engaging. It's irrelevant. It's interesting. We just talked about that. Based on what Musa just said, prior knowledge, I+1. The differentiated classroom develops agency, right? It develops agency. The differentiated classroom is a blend of whole class, grouping, and individual instruction. All right? It's a blend of whole class, grouping, and individual instruction. It's a blend. And if it's a blend, that means we have to do a lot of planning if we're a differentiated teacher. Differentiation is organic and dynamic. Okay? It's organic and dynamic. It's organic because as we talked about earlier, we have human beings that are unique, that are particular. Dr. Kamara developed particularity. So in the differentiated classroom, what we try to do is find matches between the learner and learning. We look to try to find matches between the learner and learning. And again, this is what makes a differentiated classroom different than a classroom that is not differentiated. We look to find matches, a bridge between the learner and learning. So differentiation is not a strategy. All right, I probably should have said that when I was talking about what differentiation is not. It is not a strategy. It's best practice. It's a lifestyle. It's how we conduct ourselves. It's a framework that monitors success. And differentiation is teaching up, setting goals for everyone in the classroom, and providing, so it's teaching up and it's teaching sideways. Teaching up and sideways, trying to get as many learners as we can to a goal, not having different goals for different learners, but having a goal for all learners to obtain. And then creating that implicit learning opportunities in the explicit learning opportunities, where students help each other get to that goal, which allows you, the teacher, to spend more time with students who are really struggling and providing scaffolding opportunities for those students who are really struggling. I want to start right there. Any thoughts on anything I covered there as far as what differentiation is? No, I can keep on moving. All right, let's keep on moving. Let's keep.
No, I was gonna say, Ray, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can hear you.
I was gonna say, so then basically what we're doing with the differentiation is, I don't want to reduce it, but collaborative learning, where you're going to use collaborative learning, all right, and scaffolding, because we're usually, well, in our situation where we're at, we're usually in a mixed level classroom. So then how important is the scaffolding? And are we going to talk about some techniques and tools that we can use to achieve the collaborative learning?
Absolutely.
This talk?
So to answer your first question, scaffolding is extremely important in differentiation, extremely important. And
Okay.
yeah, I'm actually, we got about 31 minutes. So I'm going to get to answer your question, because I think your question is the how is very important. And we can discuss that.
Okay.
Let's move on. Learning profile really quickly. So in the differentiating classroom, the teacher has to learn a profile. Now, what do I mean by learner profile? This goes back to, remember what we said earlier, and Cassie helped me out with this a little bit, when I asked the question of differentiation is qualitative versus quantitative. Well, it's qualitative, right, versus quantitative. So if it's qualitative, this means we have to actively and consciously every day learn a profile. Whether you're keeping mental notes, and also in this case, as you see in my slide, actual notes on students' strengths, needs, wants, needs, and expectations. Here it says strengths. Every nuance that you see, everything that you notice, it's called teacher noticing. Because just as the students are learning explicitly and implicitly, we are learning implicitly about our students. So we have to be mindful of the nuances, of student nuances, so we can be proactive. Remember, differentiation is about being proactive and helping students get through their challenges, whether it be behavior challenges, or whether it be cognitive challenges, whatever the challenges are, we have to help them, scaffold them out of that towards that challenge, right? So in order to do that, we have to mindfully learn a profile. And this is the challenge, because we already have a lot to do. But if we don't do this, then we're truly not differentiating instruction, because how do we create the scaffold if you don't know the nuances about students? So we have to consciously think about every student in our classroom, not to create a individual and personalize the instruction, but also to know what opportunities we can plan for and be flexible enough in our planning to help that student reach the intended goal or the expected goal. Does that make sense? All right. So the rationale for teaching, and I'm going to breeze through this because we only have a couple more minutes left, but the rationale, because I want to get to Musa's question about the how. The rationale for differentiated instruction is that we're teaching up, that we're providing we're providing challenges that should seek or should pique the interest of advanced students, and that we're offering scaffolding opportunities to support the slower students. And in this case, the greatest number of students succeed. Because we all know what happened when we don't, again, consciously think about slower students. The advanced students will take over the class, right? Smart students are a treasure, but they're also villains of slower students. And we know this. If you've taught in the classroom for more than 30 days, you know that a smart student can really, we like them because they help us with our lesson. They make us feel good about our teaching. However, they're villains for slower students because they can dominate a class. So in a differentiated classroom, we set up our instruction is flexible enough where we have a ceiling that's a challenge for all students, and we have time to scaffold for the slower students. All right. So how do learners learn best? And hopefully this addresses some of the issues, a part of your question, Musa. So how do people learn best? Each learner must make meaning of what is being taught. So what is being taught must be meaningful. Okay, it must be meaningful. So I'm taking a course right now, and they were talking about how students can prepare for a test or an exam. And the worst thing a student can do to prepare for a test or exam is try to cram for that test and exam. What our students do, Musa, right? You see students in the hallway, 5 minutes before the exam, looking over the chapter. That's the worst thing.
They're cramming five.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't work. I tell them it
doesn't work.
Of course,
doesn't work. In fact, research says rereading something that you already read does not work. All right. But what does work is when you read something and then you can put it in what you have read in your own words. It's more likely to go into your longer term memory, or at least your working memory, so you can pass the test. Okay. So what we know about learning is that learning has to be meaningful, that we have to it has to mean something for the students. Students need to be able to verbalize it, right? Verbalize those things when we talk about explicit learning, obviously, right? The learning has to deal with students' interests and beliefs and attitudes. All right. So the learning has to the learning has to be aligned with students' belief systems and attitudes. If you begin to challenge students' belief systems, then the information becomes unsafe. And where does that information go? To the non-thinking part of the brain. And that's when they start fighting with you, arguing with you, go to the bathroom, using their cell phone, and you have issues in the classroom. So this supports the learner profile. In a differentiated classroom, the learning must be organized. Knowledge must be clearly organized. Students have to be highly active, and assessments have to be rich, yielding meaningful feedback. All right, meaningful feedback. So if we have any English teachers teaching writing, you have to, when you give a writing opportunity for a student, the writing has to be connected with something that they already know about, prior knowledge, whether you covered it in class or hopefully you should have covered it somewhere in your class during your lesson. All right. You ask them to produce a product, and then you must give them meaningful feedback so they can grow upon that feedback. All right. That feedback also must be safe. Learning must connect with the student's passions and interests. Why? Because we have this thing called the amygdala. So again, this is why the learner profile is extremely important. You have to learn your students' want, needs, and expectations, so you can provide learning opportunities for students to connect with. Okay. So these are some non-negotiables when we talk about in a classroom. Understand that you have a wide variety of learners, that you must provide instruction for that wide range of learners. That's number one. Number two, the learning must be rich in student-centered content. It must be rich in student-centered content. All right. This is where the collaboration comes in, Musa. This is where we reduce our teacher talk, right? Students are driving the conversation. They're helping establish goals and expectations and outcomes. There's flexibility in how they learn. We're teaching in different modalities. Let me stop right there. Am I losing anyone right now? The rationale? Or does this make sense? All right. What I want to jump to now is the 4 different types of learners. So in our classroom, we have 4 different types of learners. We have the advanced learner. We have the struggler learner. So the advanced learner is the upper left young lady. She's smiling. She has her lab glasses on. She's ready to go get it. Then we have the struggling learner. His head's on his desk. He's just giving up. The other type of learner you have in your classroom is your ELL learner, or students who are trying to learn, in our case, in most of our cases, English. So the L1, they have an L1, and the L2 is English in most of our cases. So we call them ELL learners. And then we have me, bottom right. That's me, the average student in the middle, right? And I don't think I was ever the advanced student. I think I was the student in the middle. And we have to think about that student in the middle, because often they don't get recognized. They don't get the scaffolding opportunities, because the students either focused on the advanced student or the struggling student or the ELL learner, and the student in the middle, he or she is doing just enough to not garner the student's attention, the teacher's attention. So in a differentiated classroom, we think about all 4 of these learners equally. All right. And I remember any other middle students in here, I think all of you guys were advanced. I think I'm probably the only the only average student. Most of you guys were probably
No, bro.
student honor
No,
students.
bro. No, bro.
You guys
I
are
was the
extremely,
underachiever. I was the kid with his head on the book until it sunk in that I had to learn something. But then I became more motivated. But I think we've all struggled.
but the key,
Especially if you get a bad teacher, a teacher that doesn't know how to implement this plan that we're learning, about differentiation and collaborative learning, motivation. I was going to ask you about motivation. How does motivation play in all of this in this schematic? Because I've heard from a lot of teachers, many teachers, both at home and abroad, they say, well, it's not my job to motivate students, right? So I want to ask, piggyback on my first question, how does motivation play into this? And should we as educators be trying to motivate our students?
absolutely. So, the reoccurring theme is what? Want, needs, and expectations. Want, need. I probably said it 1,000 times in this conversation alone. And when we talk about want, needs, and expectations,
Right.
it's motivation. That's motivation. The differentiated,
Right.
differentiated classroom is looking at the want, needs, expectations, the nuances of all these learners, whether they're advanced, struggling, ELL, or average. What motivates these individuals? And that's why the learner profile is important, because we have to deal with that. And so that's because remember what we said. What differentiation is what? Whole group, whole class, grouping, and individual, right? And that motivation is a challenge depending on learning preferences. And I want to pause for a second for one thing, because you reminded me of something. We get this. I hear teachers say this a lot. I hear this a lot in professional developments from people. Well, we have different types of learners in our classrooms. We have kinesthetic, and they go and they look at Gardner's multiple intelligence theory, right? Kinesthetic learners and right, what is it? I think the list changes, right? It's 8. I think one time it was 8. Then now it's like 13 on the list now. And although we should include that in our learner profile and be mindful of those things, be careful about labeling your student in one of those labels. Because in a differentiated classroom, we don't label students. We recognize that we have 4 types of students in our classrooms, but we don't get into the business of labeling students a kinesthetic learner or a visual learner or auditory learner, because number one, learning preferences are totally different than what is required to teach someone. So a learning preference, I might prefer to hear music, but I might not learn anything. That's just my preference. My preference doesn't mean it's going to be effective or efficient. Because a lot of when students take learning style tests to see their learning style, those tests and those questions are based on preference, not whether they are effectively learning. Right. So if you go down that rabbit hole, you could be chasing your tail. Research has proven that yes, we should be mindful of it, but don't go. And I think I said earlier, don't get in the business of personalized instruction. Thinking, okay, I'm gonna sit Sarah over here because Sarah is more of an auditory learner. No, Sarah needs to read the book like everyone else. Now you provide Sarah with the proper scaffolding and support. And yes, yes, one of those things might be that she hears, that you give her an opportunity to hear the book, whether in class or at home or at a reading station, but she needs to read just like everyone else, right? So I just wanted because I hear a lot of teachers and a lot of professional development talk about multiple intelligences. All right. In a differentiated classroom, yes, we are mindful of that. We put it in the learner profile. However, don't get into the business of trying just to say, I'm only going to do this with Sarah. She needs the audio. No, unless they have an IEP. Now, if they have an IEP, that's something different. Cashy, what do you guys call IEPs in England? We call them individual learning plans. It's a whole legal thing for special need learners. What do you guys call that in England?
Yeah, we have an individual personalized pack for children with SEND, special educational needs and disability. So it's quite similar.
So that's what you guys call it. We call them IEPs in America. Unless they have a IEP that went through a SIT team and IEP team, then you follow the IEP. But if they don't have an IEP, then in a differentiated classroom, we teach all students through multiple modalities. Okay. So let's talk about, because I know, yeah, sure.
Just a quick question, Ray. So your special education needs and with the students in the States, are they part of the mainstream inclusive class, or are they separated and segregated from mainstream class, or is it all inclusive in the States? Because how does it work? I'd be just quite curious to know, because ours are all integrated within the mainstream class. So you'll have a student that's predicted to get an A star within the same class as a student with special education needs and disability. What's it like in the States? And just from my perspective, to get an understanding of it.
I'm gonna, just so I'm not, because we got other experts in here. Dr. Booker is not here, so I'm gonna pose that question to future Dr. Walton. Katina, are you there, Katina? I see you here.
Hi, I'm here. I'm sorry, my connection's not that great. I'm answering the question about inclusion in the States. It just depends on the individual student and their ability. Most of them are mainstream within the classroom, and they are possibly taken out maybe an hour or two if they have an IEP that specifies it. But now they're really pushing toward the kids being integrated within the classroom so that no one really knows who is special education, etc. Also, the special education teacher is not just held to helping the special education student. They kind of move around and do co-teaching so that the student is not easily identified.
Does that answer your question, Cash?
Yeah, it does. I think we pretty much have a similar system. I think we're also moving from the history direction into including the children with SEND backgrounds into the mainstream class. So it's pretty much similar. Thank you for that.
Right. So let's talk. I'm going to briefly talk about, because I think Musa wants me to talk about what we could do to support students. I think that's important. So let's talk about the advanced student. Our young lady here with the glasses, and she's ready to conquer the world. We got to understand the advanced students. Remember, they seem great, and they are, and they really they justify our existence, right? And we rely on them a lot. But remember, one, they can be villains to the struggling student, and sometimes even villains to the students in the middle. But more importantly, we got to keep, let me go back for a second. A student may be advanced in English, but not advanced in math. That's number one. So remember I said earlier, be careful about labeling students, because you can put a lot of stress on students. I might be very, very good at English or world history, the humanities, but when you put me in science and math, I suck. And that could be very stressful on a student. And that can cause things like cheating, because the expectation is, oh, Mary's smart. So now she has, that could put a lot of pressure on Mary. We don't want to put pressure on Mary. Also, if things are too easy for Mary, she can lose motivation. Going back to motivation, Musa. She can lose a lot of motivation if things are too easy, right? So we got to be careful, and this is why the learner profile is important. We can make Mary lazy if the challenge is not great enough for Mary. All right. So earlier we said I+1, right, Musa? Crashing. That works actually with, especially in language. But Mary may need I+2, right, or 3. We need to know. It's going to be based on what we know about Mary. So we got to make sure that we're giving Mary enough rigor, that she doesn't lose her motivation and become lazy. But here's another thing about advanced learners. Remember, everyone has the same goal. Mary may be moving a lot faster than everyone else. Here's the key. We want to make the learning for Mary complex and not hard. Because we can also kill Mary's motivation if we give Mary work that's too hard. So we want to add complexity to what everyone else is doing, to the lesson, right? And not make it harder, because we don't want to stress Mary out, all right? Okay. I think that's what we want to continue to build. We don't want to overpraise or underpraise Mary, all right? Because we don't want to make Mary too cocky, right? Because a lot of teachers, oh, Mary's so smart. She's so smart. She's so smart. And we can overpraise, right? Because what we want to do is we want to provide enough rigor and complexity that is continuously challenging Mary to keep her motivated and keep her focused. Well, while also making sure implicitly that she is going back and supporting the group, all right? But we're not always making her the group leader either, right? Because that's how she can become the villain, all right? So just because she's advanced doesn't mean she always gets a chance to she's always the group leader, which sometimes always happens. The smart kids get all the leadership roles, student government, school safety, class president, all these roles, right? They become the villain, all right? So we don't want to do that. So it's a balancing act with advanced learners. We got to give them enough rigor, but not make it hard, but the learning should be complex. We can't overpraise or underpraise, and we definitely cannot make the work too easy. We have to make sure that we're building advocacy in the advanced learner, so she begins to stretch herself. She begins to challenge herself. And so she then tells you what she needs to do. She begins to say, this is what I need to do next, teacher. I need to do this next, or what if I do this? And you go, all right, yeah, that sounds good with me. You know, she begins to start to stretch herself and build advocacy and more agency than she already has. Make sense? Let's see. Yeah. This is especially the case, before I move on to the strugglers, this is especially the case if you are in a school that's not high performing. The advanced learners can really get hurt in low performing schools, because what happens is the rigor is just not there for them. So then when they move into when they move into a school where, let's say they get put into a gifted and talented program, if you didn't build that agency, if you didn't build that sense of struggle where when she begins to stretch herself and become and gain advocacy, she can go into a school or a program, let's say a gifted and talented program, and totally flunk. Because she wasn't taught to struggle. Okay. So this is very important, especially if you're not in if you're in a low performing school. Struggling students. What can we do for struggling students? Don't look at them as struggling students. That's number one. See the possibility in them and don't see them as at risk. That's number one. So we have to change the way we perceive them. All right. Number two, we have to listen deeply to them. We have to let them know that we believe in them. All right. We have to let them know that they have a hidden capacity. We have to let them know that they're competent and reliable, and we need to scaffold that. So that goes back to that implicit. So a lot of things that we need to do with the struggling student is implicit. Going back to your point, Musa, we have to motivate them. All right? They definitely need to be smiled. You need to smile with them. Show those pearly whites with them. Make them feel comfortable. We have to teach them a growth mindset instead of a fixed mindset. We have to provide the proper scaffolding opportunities. Right? And we must base our teaching on to make sure the students know, understand, and then develop. With struggling students, it's very important that we teach in context. Right? Teach them, that's where R+1 comes back in, Musa, right? Teach them something you already know. It's understandable and what? Compelling. Understandable and compelling, and build on that. Understandable and compelling. Tapping into prior knowledge. Make sure the teaching is relevant. Because often with the struggling students is that they're not really struggling at all. It's that what you're teaching is not relevant. So you haven't addressed their amygdala. What's in it for me? Why do I learn this? Because the struggling student actually may be advanced. But you're so low level and you're so antiquated, the struggling student, you're not tapping into the wants, needs, and expectations of that struggling student. And then when they start producing, you go, wow, where did that come from? Right? That's because you probably didn't learn a profile properly or enough or consistently. Okay. With the struggling teachers, we have to power teach. Anyone know what I mean by power teaching? Power teaching is presenting big ideas. Make sure that we're presenting big ideas to students. All right. And then we scaffold the future teaching and scaffolding on smaller details. So it's important that we present the big picture to struggling students. They need to see the big picture first. They need to know the why. With struggling students, you cannot be ambiguous at all. You have to be clear, concise, cogent. Right? You have to be very concise with struggling students. They need to know the why. They need to know the big picture. Why is this important? What's in it for me? What's the big picture? How does it connect to what I already know? Is this relevant? Okay, because these are the things that are going on in their mind that they may not be able to verbalize to you, or may be afraid to verbalize it to you because their amygdala is saying, or their RES is already saying, this is not safe. This is not safe. Okay. And then also teach up. Right. So we teach sideways to make sure they have the supports they need but we're scaffolding up, keeping the big picture in mind, and then scaffolding the smaller ideas so they can get to the goal. Okay. Also, with the struggling student, you have to be an advocate for them. Dr. Camara DeVello talked about this in possibilities. Remember the 3 Ps? Anybody remember the 3 Ps? Practicality, possibility, and what's the other one? Anybody remember? Practicality, possibility, and particularity. All right. Particularity deals with individual students. Practicality is doing what works. Remember, Prabhu said there's no best teaching method. And then 3, possibility. And that's what struggling students, they need to deal with that possibility. Meaning you have to be brave. You might have to challenge your administrator. You might have to do some explaining on why you're doing this different strategy with that struggling student. You have to be brave for them. You have to advocate for them. Okay. It's important that you advocate for them. All right. And when they see you advocating for them and they see you supporting them, you're going to build agency in them. All right. It's going to come out. All right. ELL learners. The ELL learners understand that they're not a homogeneous group of people. All right. We know that, especially, we know that, especially you guys teaching abroad. We know that they're not homogeneous group of people. Although they may look alike, all wear thobes, all wear headscarves or wherever, they're individual learners, so keep that in mind. All right. Same thing with struggling students. See the promise in them. They will get the language one way or the other. Teach with a growth mindset. Teaching context, big picture. Same thing for the struggling students. What you teach must be relevant to their experience. Right? So teaching context. Remember, teaching context, it must be understandable and compelling. Okay. Students must know it must be a situation, that context is a situation the student understands. Teach up. Ensure the goals are clear. They know exactly where they're going. Make sure the ELL learners are accepted in the environment, that they're not isolated. Because if they feel isolated, what's happened in their brain? The RES, the reticular activating system, is saying, oh, this is not safe, this is not safe. This is not. So fight or freeze. Fight or freeze. Right? And most of the time, especially if they're not in their home country. See, here in Saudi, they're not really ELL learners, right? But if the ELL learner is learning English language in a native speaking environment. So in an ELL environment, they might not want to speak up. They don't have enough agency because they're afraid for whatever reason, for reasons. We have to build agency in those students. That's for ELL learners. A little bit different if you're teaching English like we are in Saudi. Students have normally a lot more confidence as far as speaking up for themselves in some cases. Again, build bridges between their L1 and their L2, right? This is misconception that the L2 has to be spoken 100% of the time. It's okay for them to tap into their L1 from time to time. Now, obviously, we want them to practice English as much as possible. However, using their L1 as a form of scaffolding and support is okay. Speak English as much as possible. Use different modalities as much as possible. Let's see what else. Oh, make sure that they're not invisible. They see you, you see them, they know you, they see you, you acknowledge them, they are part of the learning community. All right. Now this is again for ELL learners, individuals learning English in a native country like America or the UK. All right. Last students, let's talk about me. That's the student in the middle, the average person. The student that's forgotten. You know that middle child, the middle child syndrome? Well, the middle child syndrome can happen in the classroom. Because again, the advanced student, they're vampires. They're going to get the student's attention, the teacher's attention. The struggling students, the teacher, if it's a good student, she's going to go and support the struggling student. The ELLs are probably going to get students going to get some support. And then we have the students in the middle. Malcolm in the middle, right? So obviously, we got to understand that they're not invisible. You need to recognize them. You need to champion their cause, because often their cause is not championed in the classroom, because normally they're doing just enough to get by. Think about it. The B student really, the B and C students don't get any attention. You B and C, especially if you B minus, C, you don't get any attention. You just kind of, people look at your grade, oh, okay, whatever. Oh, honor roll. Oh, these kids are so great. Pizza parties and field trips and medallions and the students who are failing, oh, you're failing. What can we do to support you? And we're going to get your mother up here. They're getting attention. The B students and the C students, invisible. So we got to make sure they're not invisible. We're championing their cause. And we're going to help them get out of that black hole, that average student black hole. We also need to, I see Jan and Sarah, we're going to get you out here in a second. We got to make sure that we give them a growth mindset, that we instill a growth mindset in them. Champion their cause. We got to make sure that they know what is expected of them, what the learning goals are. We got to collaborate with them on their learning goals. Because unlike the struggling student who may not be in a position, or the ELL student who may not be in a position to help to really give great input on their learning goals, the struggling student can tell you exactly and give you meaningful learning goals. Okay, so make sure you include the struggling students on what they expect. Often when we talk about outcomes, we talk about outcomes from the district's point of view, or the principal's point of view, or the parent's point of view. But outcomes should really be based on the student's point of view. We do that at work, don't we? Right? At work, we look at the employee's expectation. We kind of line it up in outcomes, and we align that up. What are your goals? We ask them in interviews, we ask them in performance reviews. Well, why don't we do that with students? So struggling, the advanced student is going to tell you what needs to go down. But the student in the middle, they know, but again, they're invisible. They feel like they don't have a voice. Again, teach up. Make sure that we are giving them rigor so they understand that they are just as smart as the advanced students, that they are innovators, they're investors, they're champions, just like the advanced students. We just got to tap into their strengths. We have to provide inspiration for them. All right. And the last thing for the students in the middle is to have them focus on future and opportunities, and have them inspect what they expect. So when they're setting goals with you, have them monitor their success and communicate their success to you. Okay. Differentiation is for all these students, differentiation is not more work, or it's hard work. Remember, it can be completed as a whole group, as a whole class, as a task group, or individual. Okay. Differentiation must be interesting and engaging and focused. Must give the students the big picture. Okay? Give the students the big picture. The small things are the skills that get them to the bigger prize. So we must teach the big picture. Let's see what else I want to cover here. Overall differentiation, let's see where I'm at here. Differentiation forces the teacher to be conscious of their teaching. So, and this is how I'm going to end the conversation, and then we can, if anyone else wants to add anything. But the differentiated teacher is a coach, it's a mentor, a collaborator, facilitator, and a leader. You know, I think about what Horace Mann, I don't know, Cassie, you know who Horace Mann is. He's he's considered the father of American education. And one of the things that Horace Mann wrote in his letters is that teachers should be like statues, that students observe and rely on. Now think about a statue for a second. Statues are consistent. They're steadfast, right? They're reliable. It's always there. You can look at a statue from different perspectives. Statues are both objective and subjective. And that's what we must be. I want to stop there because I can go on and on and on. Any questions, comments, additions, amendments, criticisms, something that I didn't touch upon?
Can you talk a little bit about how are we going to implement student profiling through the use of questionnaires, or just open-ended questions and then taking notes about their responses?
So the student profile is a living document that you write down, or you keep in, you keep it in your brain, and you should write it down. How is as much as possible. So going back to Carol Ann, he would say at the end of a class, you need to reflect on your class, on that class. During that reflection period, you need to jot, you should have your book and jot down, well, Ray did this, and I learned this about Ray today. And I learned this about Cassie today. And I learned this about Katina today. And I learned this about Sierra today. And you should jot those down as soon as you can, or during the classroom. And then obviously you're not going to have time because you might have another classroom, but then sometime during that day, organize it on a spreadsheet or somewhere like this. And then use that as you plan forward. And it should, so Camara Devello would say in his post-method condition, you should be doing this after every class or during every class. As far as surveys, absolutely. So surveys are probably the best, because in an ideal world, at the beginning of the school year or before a course, you would want to sit down and do one-on-ones with a student. However, that may not be practical, right? You might not have the time to do that because now students might, there may be a million reasons why you don't want to do one-on-ones with students, right? The main reason is that you don't have the time, and maybe the students don't even have the time for it, right? But surveys would be a great one. The great thing now is we have this thing called the internet and social media and Google Classroom. And, there are programs like, there's several programs that you can download for free. I can share them with you later. They're escaping my mind right now, where they're learner profiling programs. The beauty of Google Classroom is that it's free. We can communicate with our students. We can put surveys up. We can do climate checks. Remember, what color is your parachute? The Dr. Davis, you want to chime in on the ways you can get to learn about people and learn about your students? Because this is kind of your territory.
Yeah, so like you said, one-on-ones, but I know, like you said, with time, that's not always a possibility, but I found that to be, after taking notes, like you said, whether written or just kind of notes about students that might seem checked out in the classroom or might have some difficulties following up. Like I said, my students are at the master's level, so they're not, I've counseled children in elementary, but they're adults. But I think it still applies and really just kind of following up. And that's one of the notes that I had put here. It seems that this differentiated teachers is really, I wrote, they really seem like they're really available. And like you said, with the statute, they're really reliable, a very dynamic person that's accessible. And so I've followed up with students, haven't used the Google Classroom, but just like Zoom, where we meet one-on-one in a virtual space to talk. I found that that's, students have requested that, and I've requested that, and that seems, at least in this space, to be a more flexible way for students, for us to meet in terms of timing. And so yeah, one-on-ones in the office and then virtual. And after, of course, after the classroom, and then I've met before the classroom time as well. And I've noticed that, and I was taking notes when you was talking about, I think you said ESL, is that the acronym?
ELL?
ELL, excuse me, thank you. ELL, yes. And I found that for me, it seemed, being in Florida, there's so much diversity here, and there are many students who've been educated in their native country and common. So there's a lot of need to really have I found more of that one-on-one outside of the classroom, mentor, in addition to teaching. And so I found that it's been helpful and requested to really have like standing meetings. Now, granted, as faculty, it takes a lot of time, but I found that that's really helpful so that they don't get lost in a more one-on-one explanation of what was taught in the classroom. So more time, but I've noticed that it helps create rapport and then fill in some spaces that maybe language and just culture makes it difficult to understand certain things. So a lot of that mentor piece I've found really comes in addition to being an instructor, just that additional support.
And I would say also, Musa, when you're doing the scaffolding, because you're going to be doing a lot of scaffolding, that's one-on-one time there. You're going to learn a lot, because as you're moving around in the groups, and you're going to do one-on-ones and in groups, because you're going to break the groups into triads, quad. So that's your one-on-one time right there. So you can, hey, so how you doing today? And you'll find out, we can find out especially younger students will tell you everything. I'm hungry.
Right.
Mommy and daddy were fighting last night. I ain't getting any sleep because they were fighting until 3 a.m. The police came. Right? And then you get to say, oh, now it's making sense. Now this stuff makes sense. And the reality is, if you connect with even older students, I've had adult students tell me and my husband are, teacher, I'm sleeping in my car because, if I go home, then it's going to be a problem. And you go, wow. And then that hardcore, turn your work in and it must be due. Then you go, wow. So we don't understand people's struggle. Remember, we started this conversation, I think Cassie said it. We teach humans. And humans have life. And life can suck, right? And unfortunately for our babies, for all our learners, whether they are juveniles or adults, people are going through life. And so in those scaffolding moments, you will find out a lot during the classroom. And trust me, if somebody says something traumatic, you don't even have to write it down. Like that's already in, because that'll go into your episodic memory, right? It's going to go into your episodic memory because it's a shock, and you'll know what to do from there. Any other? I want to stop there because I want to take. I got 7 minutes left, so I wanted to. Any questions, amendments, comments?
Yeah, Ray, I was going to ask you a question. I think, well, first of all, thank you for the insightful presentation. I think it was more of a human approach to differentiation. Often, I think some of the sessions of previous past about differentiation, they can be quite superficial and quite militant in their ways. I wanted to ask you a question about the other side of the table, about the teachers and the staff. How do you deal with, or what's your advice rather on dealing with a culture of complacency amongst the staff when it comes to differentiation? And, you know, it's, like I said to you earlier, in England, we have a national curriculum. Everybody across the board will study the same content of curriculum. And sometimes teachers can often be quite militant in their ways. And I think that this is the point you mentioned about the quantitative and the qualitative. And I think we have more in our department, teachers that just focus on this is the content of the curriculum. This is the exam at the end of the year. This is how I'm going to execute the pedagogy. You fail, you pass. And then you have rarely the teachers that approach it, as you said, from the perspective of, I'm going to treat you all as individuals. But there's a sense of cultural complacency sometimes in certain departments. And often that can be a bit of a struggle to change the mindset of the staff rather than the children. So what's your advice on that?
So my advice is that you can't be in the business of changing adults. People, you know, remember how we started this conversation. Good meat makes its own gravy. You know, if you are out there doing your best practices, hopefully people are observing and then asking, why are Cashie's kids happy? Why are they happy during exam time? Why does he not have all these classroom referrals to the principal? You know, what's going on with his students? Why is his students always engaged? Why are they not in the hallways? Why we don't see his students running around in the hallways or with the hall pass? And then hopefully Cassie becomes the principal and the superintendent, a person of influence where you can admit it to more people. But, you know, it goes back to the saying, you know, the golden rule. What is the golden rule? What's the golden rule, Kashi?
As in the, I know the idiom, he who
I'll tell you, he who has the goal makes the rules, right? Yeah, so the reality is you can't go, if that's the mindset of the environment of the organization, the only thing you can do is like Camara DeVallo said, be the possibilities, the 3 Ps, possibility, be brave. Be that one lone knight who's going out there championing the cause of learners. And hopefully people see it and learn from you, and students praise on you and say, Mr. Kashi is the best. And people are trying to figure out why you're the best. And that's all you can do, because once you try to change the climate, like actively change the climate, number one, you're not focusing on your students, which is your goal. And number two, you make enemies, right? And we're not trying to make enemies, because you will have enemies. If you stand up in the meeting, and I learned this the hard way, brother. And Musa and I deal with this in our environment. In fact, I think this is going to be Musa's research. It's about complacency because we work in an environment. I probably shouldn't say this, but we work in an environment that can be very complacent. So, and when I first got there, the first couple of years, you guys, and then I realized you're not going to change.
Yeah.
The best thing I could do is make sure that the students that I'm assigned to are getting the best Ray Roberts. They're getting the best Ray Roberts, and then they go off and say, man, Mr. Ray he's awesome, right? Or he may be hard, but he's fair. And I learned. And at the beginning of the year, I couldn't write, and at the end, now I can write, right? That's your prize, brother. And hopefully people see that gravy coming out of you and want to emulate you. If you go in and fight that battle, it's a headache, and you gain enemies. And why do that? We already have challenges as teachers as it is. We get more with honey than we can with vinegar. And anybody else want to address that? Because I think that's a great question.
Yeah. So I was.
Nate, we haven't heard from you. You want to?
Dr.
Musa?
Katina has her hand up. Dr. Katina
Oh,
has
okay.
her hand
Okay,
up.
I'm sorry. Yes, just Doc.
No, I was just going to say, reiterate what you said. The biggest thing is focus on your students. You're always going to have negative naysayers or whatever, but just focus on your students, and your students become your best mouthpiece. And then your students will even say, well, in his class, I can do A, B, and C. I'm not learning something here. And you don't even have to, because the other teachers will comment, well, what are you doing? So it's pretty much what Ray is saying. You just keep your head down, focus on your students, mentor your students, and that light will shine. That light will radiate. Don't worry about those around you who aren't doing A, B, C, or D. They're seeing you do A through Z, and they will come and inquire about it. So that's the best advice.
No, thank you very
And
much.
as an
It's,
administrator, Kashi, if you want to change that climate, love on your students. Love on your teachers, right? So as an administrator, if you want to change that mindset, love on your teachers, and your teachers will love on your students, right? That's how it works. If you're bullying your teachers are going to bully the students. So as an administrator, that's how we change. We love on our teachers as administrators. We do all those things. We become the differentiated administrator. And we support our teachers the same way we want our students to be supported. And watch what happens. It flows down. They give the students the same energy, right? All right, I think my time is up. Thank you for spending 2 long, tedious hours with me. I appreciate you. My family has to do it. Dr. Davis has to do it because she's family, but everyone else, you didn't have to do it. So I appreciate you sitting and talking about a very important, critical conversation to teaching and learning. Hopefully we can do it again. And hopefully you guys can lead the conversation. Thank you for your time. This will be recorded, or is being recorded. So if you want a copy of the recording, you can just send me a message and I can give you a copy of the recording. Again, thank you for your time, everyone. Have a successful new year, and I hope to speak to everyone soon.
thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. Hey, Musa,
Yeah.
are we going, are we virtual or what?